Welcome back, ghosts, ghouls, and things that go bump in the night, to another creepy episode of the Haunted Horrorstorian. You know, I was just out in Bigfoot country, and it really had me thinking about cryptids. That being said, I really felt like this story was perfect for this week. So, make sure nothing's watching, take a seat, relax, and tune in for the story of the Flat Folk. Have you ever heard of the Flat Folk? My dad used to tell stories about them, being so impossibly thin that a strong gust of wind could whisk them away, never to be seen again. It should come as no surprise that the Flat Folk grew to fear the winds. To them, the winds were these unstoppable, invisible currents that stole their loved ones away in the dead of night and banished them to lands unknown. According to my dad, the Flat Folk eventually learned to fight the winds by anchoring themselves to trees, wrapping their long limbs around the sturdiest of trunks, and coming down only to eat and drink. I always thought it had to have been a sad existence. The Flat Folk were cowed into submission by these devastating forces beyond their control or understanding. And what else could they do? They had no choice but to live their lives in constant fear. Their only moments of reprise, when they untangled their limbs and crawled along the forest floor to gouge themselves on mushrooms, was when they were left most vulnerable to the forces that had come to govern their lives. And I hate to say it, but I never understood the point of these stories. Well, not like stories need to have a point, but for how often my dad used to tell them, you'd think there'd be some kind of deeper meaning. From what I could recall, there was never any kind of conclusive morale to take away, at least none that I could see. They never really seemed to lead anywhere. Anyway, I found a Flat Folk in my garden the other day. Crazy, right? I guess there must have been more to these stories after all. Then again, I can't help but wonder which came first, the chicken or the egg. In my case, I guess it would be the Flat Folk, or the unorthodox bedtime stories. Had my dad seen a Flat Folk, and this is what inspired these stories? Or is it his stories that somehow spawned the Flat Folk into existence? I mean, stranger things have happened, right? Well, no, I guess it doesn't get much stranger than this. I'd ask the old man myself, but, well, you know. Sorry, I'm rambling again. You're probably more curious about the Flat Folk, understandably so. I was standing in my kitchen, half awake and bleary-eyed, probably using my 2 functioning brain cells to decide whether I wanted a bowl of Cocoa Puffs or Cheerios, when I saw it, that thing in my peripheral vision. It was a vaguely humanoid mass. Its long and dangling limbs were wrapped around the wooden trellises, propping up my pepper plants. It caught me off guard, to say the least. I yelped loud enough to set off my neighbor's dogs, not that they usually needed much of an excuse to start yapping away at 6 o'clock in the morning. I remember jumping back far enough to slam the back of my head against one of the ceiling cabinets. My cereal of choice, Cocoa Puffs, obviously, went flying everywhere. It seems like a bit of an overreaction in hindsight, but at the moment it looked as though there was some half-naked weirdo hiding out in my garden. For all I knew, that creep could have been rubbing himself against my pepper plants as he watched me scamper around my kitchen in a frantic daze, staring me down like some sort of spicy pervert. Too much information? Yeah, too much information. I grabbed the nearest weapon, a ceramic gravy dish, and ran up to the door leading to my backyard, probably hollering something about how he'd have to pay for my pepper plant's therapy bills. Luckily, with the few wits I still had about me, I realized that the thing tangled in my garden wasn't a person. It couldn't have been. I wasn't sure what it was, but as my adrenaline faded, I noticed that the thing was too thin to be a human. Impossibly thin. To call it paper thin would be an understatement. As its dangling limbs waved with the breeze, they seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Its limbs were so thin that from the right angle, they barely registered in my field of vision. I prematurely sighed in relief, rationalizing to myself that this thing must be some sort of kite, or maybe a funky art experiment that my neighbor's kids had lost track of. It wasn't the first time their junk had found its way into my yard. Just a few days ago, I found a teapot with a bunch of helium balloons tied around the handle, caught in the branches of my apple tree. Apparently, it was part of some school project gone wrong. Kids will be kids, I guess. I made a mental note to fish their weird kite thing out from the garden and leave it back at their house, accompanied by a half-hearted attempt at chastising the little rascals. I even afforded myself a relieved chuckle as I set the gravy dish on the counter next to me. And then the bastard blinked. I yelped again, sending the neighbor's dogs into another barking frenzy, and swiped for the little ceramic gravy dish, only to send it falling to the ground, where it shattered on impact. Mondays, am I right? Well, it was technically a Wednesday, but you get my point. I steadied myself against the counter, catching my breath for long enough to calm my jittering nerves. As this renewed burst of adrenaline started to fade, I hesitantly looked back out the door, looking back at that thing. It had the audacity to blink again and again, and then one of its arms seemed to twitch in a weak spasm, as if acknowledging my horrified gaze. At this point, I should have realized that this thing, this whole situation, was well beyond my non-existent pay grade. Part of me knew in that moment that I should have stepped back and called the police, or animal control, or literally anyone else. But no. Instead, I decided to take a closer look. I tiptoed towards the door, navigating the minefield of broken ceramic and chocolatey cereal balls scattered across the kitchen floor. Some part of me, a faint echo in the back of my tiny pea-sized mind, began to connect the pieces between the thing in my garden and the flat folk from the stories of my youth. There must have been some logical conclusion nestled away in that foggy corner of my mind, dangling just beyond my mental grasp, but I ignored it and pressed on. Maybe it was for the best. Knowing my mental state in that moment, there's a good chance that trying to dig deeper would have just broken me. I stepped into the garden and knelt down in the grass, keeping a few feet's worth of distance between myself and that thing. Despite how horrified I had been just a few seconds prior, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy as I looked over at the thing. Its long limbs, thin as they were marked with rips and tears, likely a byproduct of its apparent crash landing into my backyard. A splintered piece of wood trellis had punctured through its lower midsection, having seemingly shredded its wafer-like body with ease. Its eyes, deep and blue, stared back at me, scared and pleading. With the gift of hindsight, I can confidently say that what I did next was incredibly stupid. I inched my way closer to the thing, hesitantly at first, but gaining more confidence with each step as I saw just how completely and utterly pathetic it was. Maybe it was stupid, but you would have done the same, right? You find this almost human-like alien thing just outside your house, injured and helpless, pleading for your help. Isn't that pretty much the plot of E.T.? What heartless monster wouldn't want to help E.T.? Well, if I knew E.T. was this much of a jerk, I would have had second thoughts. At this point, I was crouched right in front of the thing. I spoke to it tentatively. Can you understand me? The thing didn't reply. It just stared at me with those big, blue, teary eyes. I sighed. Look, little buddy, I'm gonna try and get you out of here, okay? I doubt it understood my feeble attempts at diplomacy. There's a reason I never volunteered to be humanity's ambassador for first alien contact. Not that the option would have, in just about any other circumstance, have been available to me. I gingerly reached out, intending to lift its body off of the wooden trellis, hoping I wouldn't cause any more damage than it had already sustained. Unfortunately, I never got the chance. As soon as my hand brushed against its torso, as its skin made contact with mine, he just squelched onto my arm. Squelched. I don't know how else I'd describe it. It was like, you know that feeling when you stretch a rubber band to its absolute limit, only to let it snap close around your finger? No? Just me on that one? Okay. Well, do your best to imagine that. But now, picture the rubber band, still maintaining that same level of elasticity and snappiness, is made out of something gooey and viscous. It's as if a gallon of maple syrup was poured onto my arm, but with enough force to have been dropped from a jet fighter several miles above. It was a sensation completely and utterly alien to me. I remember falling on my back, screaming out in pain and surprise, only no sound came out. It was more of a haggard wheeze as the wind was knocked out of me. This thing, once a helpless mass of battered limbs and sad eyes, was now fastened tightly around my lower arm. I nearly heaved the contents of my stomach as I felt its eyes, swimming atop the gelatinous mass of tissue, stitching itself into my flesh, bulging and pulsing against my wrist. I've tried everything. I've tried scraping my arm against the rough brickwork on the side of my house. I've tried poking and prodding at it with a steel poker from my barbecue set. I've even tried taking a lighter and holding the flame against the grotesque thing on my arm. None of it has worked. At best, my attempts seem to merely agitate it, sending its gelatinous mass into a fit of violent spasms as it digs itself deeper into the flesh of my arm. It made my head swim and my stomach upset. And at worst, my best attempts at removing this thing just caused it to spread upwards, letting its tapeworm-like appendages wriggle their way higher and higher up my arm. At the time of me writing this to you, the thing is still clung firmly to my arm. It's wiggled its way up to the base of my neck. Its grotesque, squirming mass of a body now spans from the tips of my fingers to the tops of my shoulder. I think it's starting to compel my movements, maybe even my thoughts. Maybe it already has, and I'm only just now noticing the effects. I can feel my fingers twitching and shuddering against their will, moved by the same force that's slowly poking and prodding its way towards my mouth. I dread to think what'll happen when it wiggles its way inside. I've tried to call for help, but no sound will come out. I've thought about getting up and running, but the thought is just as easily pushed out of my mind. replaced with a sluggish desire to sit and let the thing finish its work. With my free hand, I'm typing away at this letter, but even this task is becoming harder and harder with every agonizing second. I'm sending this for 2 reasons. 1, a selfish desire to have something outlast me, and 2, to make an amendment to the stories my dad used to tell me about the flat folk. The flat folk are real, and they're tired of living in fear. I can't help but feel like they envied us. How they envied our ability to walk into the wind while they could only cower from it. How could they not? They wasted their lives anchored to trees in a desperate attempt to spare themselves from the forces we view as so trivial. I don't know how I could possibly know this, how I could possibly not just understand, but feel their bitter anger and resentment bubbling away inside me. What I do understand is that the flat folk have found another way to brave the wind, and I think that plan involves us. And that, dear listeners, is all that was sent to me about the flat folk. Have you seen them? Maybe clinging to the trees as you hike through the woods. Maybe anchored to a bush in your own backyard or your side garden. Please, if you've had any experiences, let us know. I'm always available at hauntedhorrorstorian@gmail.com, or you can find me and the show on Facebook by looking up Haunted Horrorstorian Podcast. That's all I have for this week. Until next time, stay spooky, dear listeners, and remember, sometimes it's more than just a story.